First of all, I would like to thank the Secretary General of Marmara Municipality Union, Cemil Çiçek, and the Maruf team, and Ms. Burcu. Today and in the coming days, we are going to have 4 different panels on migration. This marks the first and most comprehensive of such panels. We have very valuable guests and speakers, so being the moderator of such a panel is a real honor for me. So, without further ado, I would like to invite our panelists to the podium. We have a limited time, an hour and a half, so we can start right away. First of all, Elizabeth Ferris. Let me invite Elizabeth Ferris. Elizabeth Ferris is from Georgetown University. When I give her the floor, I will briefly talk about her CV. And in the applications and in the other documents, you will find the CVs, so let's not spend a lot of time on reading everyone's CVs. Second speaker, Katharina Lumpp from UNHCR Turkey. She's the director, country director. Then we have Howard Duncan, Metropolis, Canada, executive. And he has been the president of one of the largest networks on migration for long years, and International Migration Journal. He's also the editor of that very well-known journal. And my professor, Ahmet İçduygu from Koç University, Migration Studies. He is the founding director. And the last but not the least, from Columbia University, Neeraj Kaushal. Our topic today is international human mobility and social cohesion. As you all know very well, in the most recent years, this is an ever-increasing problem, especially in Turkey. We're talking more and more about migration and human mobility. Is this human mobility on a voluntary basis or in an involuntary basis? Is it immigration or emigration? Is it women or young people or senior people who are changing places? We are all interested in these topics. Since 2014, Turkey is the country that is hosting the highest number of refugees. And we also know that there are 6.5 million people originally from Turkey who live abroad. So throughout the time, we have always been involved with migration, but there are other migration movements and human mobility activities taking places elsewhere in the world as well. So this is going to be a general panel, not only specific to the human mobility in Turkey, but we will also see the situation in global context, and we will talk about social cohesion. With your permission, I would like to ask Elizabeth Ferris to be the first speaker. I think she has a presentation, so if the technical colleagues can put the slides on the screen, I will give her the floor. But in the meantime, maybe I can introduce you, Elizabeth. She's from Georgetown University, Migration Studies. She's a research professor. She is also teaching at the Faculty of Law of the same university for long years. She has worked as a highest level consultant at the United Nations, and between 2006 and 2015 at the Brookings Institute, she again worked on migration and human mobility. As I told you, you already have the CVs, so I won't take your time to read the CVs, but we can also get questions through the application. You can also ask questions from the application. Every speaker has 10 minutes, and the first speaker is Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. This session is looking at human mobility and social integration. And before we get into talking about international mobility, I thought it would be good to introduce the issue of internal displacement. Internal displacement gets a lot less attention than refugee movements, although the numbers are far greater. Next slide, please. Okay, this will make things a lot easier. Okay. Okay. Yeah, today we hear often that we have record numbers of people who are displaced, over 70 million people. But 2/3 of those, 40 million, are people who are displaced within the borders of their own country, internally displaced persons, or IDPs as they are known. Increasingly, the population of IDPs are urban. Estimates are between 60 and 80% of those 40+ million people live in urban settings. And increasingly, just as the case with refugees, displacement is protracted. Somewhere around 80% of all IDPs in the world have been displaced for more than 4 or 5 years. Dealing with issues of protracted displacement is different than responding to the immediate humanitarian needs of those who are displaced. Internal displacement is an issue of social cohesion. People displaced within the borders of their own country are often treated with suspicion, discrimination. There's a stigma attached to being displaced, probably in most countries of the world where there are people who've been displaced within the borders of their own countries because of conflict, violence, other forms of civil unrest. Sometimes there's tension between the host community and those who arrive, parallel in some ways to situations of refugees. So, for example, in Colombia, which has almost the world's largest number of IDPs, close to 8 million people, a lot of times people are moving to cities, they're living on the margins of large cities, and the conflict with the host population often comes over issues of employment, livelihoods, competition for positions within the informal sector. Issues of internal displacement are also related to peace, security, development, reconstruction. You look at Syria right now that has over 6 million internally displaced persons, and certainly the way in which people are integrated into their communities or able to return to their home communities and reestablish relations with neighbors will have a lot to do with the eventual stability, security, and peace in Syria. This chart shows a comparison of the number of IDPs, internally displaced people, and refugees over the past 20 years or so. And you'll see the blue figures represent internal displacement. The orange represents refugees, those who have crossed an international border. While the number of refugees has increased, the biggest increase has been in the numbers of people displaced within the borders of their countries. Some of that is because borders are increasingly closed. It's harder and harder for desperate people to cross into another country. And some of that increase is undoubtedly due to the fact that we're keeping better records. We're more aware of internal displacement than we were 20 years ago. However, in spite of these large numbers of people on the move, in spite of the risks it poses to social cohesion, peace, and security, they were mentioned only in passing in the 2 new global compacts that were adopted in December 2018. And there's a reference to displacement as part of the context for dealing with refugees, but no sustained international effort to deal with the problem of internal displacement. In part, this is because of the fact that internal displacement is an issue of national sovereignty. It's national authorities who are given the responsibility for dealing with IDPs. The definition of IDPs, as included in the guiding principles on internal displacement, is actually much broader than the definition of refugees. It includes causes such as generalized violence, violations of human rights, human or man-made natural disasters. But the figures I just cited, the 40 million, are those displaced by conflict and human rights violations. Another 20 million people a year or so are displaced because of disasters. We know much less about them. We assume that much of that displacement is temporary, floods occur, people move, and then they go back home. But we really don't know. There's been very few studies of protracted displacement following disasters. Often people are displaced for exactly the same reason as those who become refugees. There is no binding international convention comparable to the 1951 Refugee Convention for IDPs. Instead, there is a general set of principles that were presented to the UN, but were not adopted. It's not a treaty that's open for signature. There is no mandated UN agency. For refugees, we have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and yet even though there are many more IDPs than refugees, the system we have for responding on the international level is a collaborative one called the cluster approach, by which different agencies agree to take responsibility for specific sectors. And often there's a lack of dedicated funding. It's hard sometimes to find out how much governments are spending on IDPs or even international agencies. We don't say that IDPs have more needs or suffer more than those who are not displaced, and indeed those who are trapped and unable to escape or closer to the violence are often more vulnerable than those who are displaced internally or those who end up crossing an international border. But they do have specific needs: shelter, documentation, access to services, livelihoods, protection. And oftentimes, because most IDPs are in urban settings, those responsibilities fall on local authorities, municipalities. In many countries, well, about 40 countries of the world have some kind of national policy on internal displacement. But even when you have a really good national policy, if the funds or the authority don't pass down to the municipal level, that causes real hardships. In Colombia, for example, municipalities have the responsibility to educate all displaced children in their area, and yet often they don't receive an increase in funds to deal with larger numbers of IDP children who arrive there. It's a responsibility of national authorities to deal with IDPs, unlike refugees where there's a degree of international responsibility. And some of the challenges that are faced, first of all, displacement is a dynamic process. People move often many times within the borders of their country looking for safety, whether it's Syria or El Salvador. The information we have is that people are displaced over and over again. You know, they'll go and stay with an aunt while the violence is bad, and then they'll go back home, and then they'll go stay someplace else looking for safety or protection within the country in which they're living. The research isn't very good, but we're beginning to see the relationship between internal displacement and cross-border displacement. Again, the case of El Salvador, where there's been large numbers of Salvadorans seeking protection in other countries, but the average is that they've been displaced 4 to 6 times within their country before they travel overseas. We also see that when people are returned to their country of origin, say from Afghanistan, rejected asylum seekers, and can't go back to their own original community, they join the ranks of internally displaced people. So there's a relationship between cross-border movement and also movement within the country. The data we have on IDPs is much less robust than that we have for refugees. Access is almost always a problem, particularly when conflicts are ongoing. To even reach IDPs to provide assistance or count them or find out what their needs are is difficult. You can think about the situation around Idlib right now, for example, where we know that there are thousands and thousands of people who are displaced, but the ability to access them is limited. The key seems to be in developing national laws and policies, but many of the countries with large numbers of IDPs don't have any policies. They don't have anything that particularly directs local officials or others to ensure that the needs of IDPs are met. And finally, when we look at solutions, IDPs can go back to their community of origin. They can integrate locally, and here you see the importance of social cohesion. A study we've been doing with the International Organization for Migration in Iraq, it has looked at IDPs over a 4-year period, interviewing the same people every year and sending SMS messages every month to look at how often people are moving, why they move from one place or another, and we're finding it's a quite dynamic process. In the case of Iraqi IDPs, social cohesion seems to increase over time. So those who've been displaced for 3 or more years report they're getting along better with their neighbors, they feel more accepted, they have more friends in the new situation, they're more active politically. You know, that's what you would expect to see is increases in social integration, social cohesion with the passage of time. Or IDPs can settle elsewhere in the country. And again, sometimes you see these multiple patterns of displacement. There are generational differences when it comes to solutions. Oftentimes the parents harbor a dream of going back to their home community, but younger people, the kids who've grown up in urban settings, aren't so interested in going back to the community of origin, particularly when it's a rural area and they become accustomed to an urban lifestyle. Just some of the figures for Syria: 6.2 million IDPs. 630,000 new displacements just in the last few months in Syria. In Iraq, 2 million IDPs, but Iraq is actually a hopeful case. That's down from a high of 6 million just a couple of years ago. Whoops. So, thank you very much, and yep. Thank you. I just think that we need to look at internal displacement when we're looking at the whole gamut of mobility and not just focus on those who cross international borders, although they seem to be seen as much more an issue of international concern than those who are displaced within their country. Thank you.
Evet, çok teşekkür ederiz. Bu aslında
Thank you. This has been a great framework. Let us move on to Katharina Long. She is with UNHCR in Turkey. She is the director, but previously she served in many different countries and was in charge in similar responsibilities. I do not wish to read through the CVs in order not to lose time, so I'm going to skip this bit, but since 2017, she's been in Turkey, but prior to that, she served in Afghanistan and many other nations, Cote d'Ivoire and many other countries. She was involved in many different operations. So she's going to give us a global snapshot about mobility and offer us the UN perspective as well.
the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Murat Bey, and I hope that I can complement taking the cues from Elizabeth Ferris and focus on the other aspect of forced displacement, that is refugees. When we look at human mobility, obviously the largest group are the estimated 250 million migrants globally. And when we need to look at social cohesion, it is important to distinguish between those who move voluntarily and those that are forced to move. Many of them having gone through traumatic experiences. So when you look at how you can overcome distance and social distance between those arriving in a community or those forced to flee, this distinction is important to bear in mind as experience shows. And also the distinction as to whether they are displaced within their own country, very often for the very same reasons that prompt refugees to cross international borders, or whether they arrive from another country, so have crossed the border. It has been mentioned, we have seen for the last 6 years continuously a steady increase in forced displacement, about 2/3 internally within their own countries, and about now 25.9 million who have crossed international borders. That's the highest for the last 6 years when these numbers were steadily increasing. That means, and I just I just have part of it in a presentation because I think to reflect figures, it's easier to see them. There are some. So last year there were about 37,000 people forcibly displaced every single day, and the percentage of children among those displaced has increased. It's more than half, it's about 52%. Some of the trends have not changed, are not significantly changed. What we see with regard to refugee movements is that about 50%, slightly more than 50% are hosted only by 10 countries. Sorry, wrong slide. And that includes some of the poorest countries of this globe. And Turkey, it was mentioned, continues to host the largest number of refugees for 5 years now in a row. Other trends have not changed, that it is the same countries that cause the majority of the displacement, both internally and externally, and none of the conflicts that cause this displacement have been resolved. To date, there is hope that we will possibly see voluntary return to South Sudan, but the refugees and the displaced are watching developments carefully, concerned that the conflict will erupt again. Another important trend, and it was mentioned for internally displaced, that has not changed but is continuing, is that there is an increasing number of refugees, estimated at over 60%, who live in cities or peri-urban or rural areas, and not as many of the images suggest, in camps. This trend of allowing refugees freedom of movement, allowing them to settle with the host community in municipalities, in cities, that is bound to increase. In the New York Declaration that Elizabeth Ferris also referred to, all the 193 member states of the United Nations have declared that they recognize that refugee camps should be the exception, to the extent possible, only a temporary measure in response to an emergency. And here in Turkey, for example, the government has, during last year and this year, implemented alternatives to camps. They have supported residents of temporary accommodation centers to move and settle in and relocate in host communities. So here in Turkey, only 1.7% of the over 3.6 million Syrians now live in temporary accommodation centers, and the others live in host communities, in municipalities across Turkey. Other large host countries, for example, Ethiopia, has pledged to provide refugees with more freedom of movement, and is in the process of also implementing a policy that allows alternatives to camps. Important against this backdrop and these trends and these developments, there have been these important discussions at the global level that, from the perspective of many of us who've worked in internal displacement and refugee responses, we consider them quite groundbreaking. And these are the New York Declaration, which resulted in two compacts, global compacts, one on safe, orderly and regular migration and one on refugees to be developed and concluded. The Global Compact on Refugees was affirmed last year in December. I don't want to go into many of its details. I just want to flag a few of the aspects that speak to the role of municipalities and that speak to social cohesion. That in quite an important consensus were recognized as being extremely important in successful, comprehensive and effective refugee responses. The Global Compact has 4 objectives, and one objective, and this is really groundbreaking and new for us as an organization, and for many more stakeholders that were previously not involved, is to ease pressure on host countries and host communities. This truly provides, first of all, it recognizes that countries hosting refugees do so, they do so and act on behalf of the international community. And they deliver what the High Commissioner referred to, a global public good. And they need support, and they deserve support. That way, we now have a basis in the Global Compact on refugees that allows many more actors to provide support to host countries and host communities of refugees because they host refugees. Not only because they meet development criteria or because there is more resources available to go beyond meeting the immediate needs of refugees. No, a comprehensive refugee response now has as an objective that we can mobilize, support countries and communities because they host refugees, and not as an add-on as it used to be the case. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Then another important feature in these global discussions and featuring in both the New York Declaration and the Global Compact on Refugees is really the role of local actors, local institutions, municipalities, and they are, as mentioned, as an actor at the forefront of refugee responses, and they are referenced as requiring sustained support in order to be able to do so. The Global Compact tries to project and tries to implement what is often referred to as a whole of society approach, and there really highlights in several instances the role of municipalities, not only national authorities but local authorities. Speaking to social cohesion, and then I have to stop. With regard to social cohesion, which is referenced in these global discussions and in the Global Compact as peaceful coexistence, we now have in many refugee response situations, including here in Turkey, we have really engaged more and more at the local level and in trying to promote and foster and support efforts aimed at social cohesion. We define social cohesion here, we've developed a framework, we define it as the nature of the relationship between the refugees and the host communities, as well as between these groups and the local institutions. We need to look at, and in order to effectively promote and foster social cohesion, we need to look at several of its dimensions. One is the a more objective way of how connected are these groups. But then there is a very important subjective dimension, which is attitudes. And that needs to be distinguished when we look at both the causes for social tensions or distance between the communities, but also when we look at how we best promote and foster social cohesion. In Turkey, obviously, one very important obstacle to connectedness is the language barrier, and has been the language barrier. And it's interesting to observe that in our participatory assessments, in our discussions with refugees of all gender, age groups, the importance of learning Turkish is now the #1 priority when we speak to refugees. So as a result, we have invested a lot now in trying to support investment into Turkish language classes. And in a way, it's interesting. We see that, Murat Bey is the one who knows best among us. We see that the refugees are getting closer, want to get closer, want to be able to communicate, and Turkish society seems to, as time passes and the situation becomes more protracted, seems to get more distant to the refugees. What has proven an important tool to foster social cohesion is, and we've started to do that with authorities here in Turkey, as an example, we engage directly, jointly with the authorities, with both groups of refugees and host community representatives. And from these discussions come a lot of very important recommendations as to what can be done to bring the groups closer together, to create also opportunity for social interactions. Another important role, and their municipalities have been key partners, is at the local level for municipalities to somehow enable mechanisms that allow participation of refugees, not necessarily in decision-making fora, but to be heard by city councils, and to enable mechanisms for participation in social life. Then 2 last points. What very often speaks to attitudes developing that bring distance to the groups, refugees and the host community, is a lack of information, wrong information, and because of a lack or wrong information, perceptions that create a distance. It's therefore extremely important to strengthen communication with the refugees, with the host community, and to invest in providing, first of all, to invest into listening also to the concerns, but then also to invest in providing factually correct information and correct wrong information. That is the basis on which one can start working to address perceptions. Then obviously, and this is important, I already mentioned, is really to create opportunities for direct contact and joint activities. This is what can reduce the distance. Very often it's not my neighbor, but it's all the other refugees. But to start with connecting with one and with another helps to also create more, reduce the social distance. Last but not least, the way in which refugees are portrayed in the media and in the public discourse by political leaders, by local leaders, is really a key factor for social cohesion. They play an important role in setting the tone at the local level. And that alone is a reason that we need to pursue debates, such as in this forum, and to strengthen the engagement with actors at the local level to keep the discourse sane and factual and accurate, and to try to find joint solutions to challenges. Thank you.
Okay. Çok Katharina Lumpp, Birleşmiş Milletler.
Yes, Katharina Lumpp is the Turkey country director for UNHCR. I would like to thank her so much. She touched upon important details and she has incredible experience so that she can combine what's happening in Turkey with the international trends. And we have our mayor from Zeytinburnu with us. Welcome. Zeytinburnu was a municipality that was attaching great importance to social cohesion activities even before the refugees came to Turkey. They are a very important municipality. So we're talking about social cohesion, but of course local cohesion is also very important. Now I will give the floor to Howard Duncan. And very recently he had a study for the IOM, and he assessed the roles of the cities for that study. He majored in philosophy, but he's one of the most important specialists in the world in terms of migration. He's the leader of Metropolis in Canada, and the Metropolis migration community, which is the largest community, I guess, in the world. He is also one of the executives of that, and with Professor Ahmet, we have always been proud to be a member of that board. Every year, we attend the Metropolis congresses where they talk about migration issues. I'm extremely happy that Harvard is here. So let me repeat once again for our young academics. One of the most important journals in the field of migration, International Review. He's also the editor. So Howard, the floor is yours.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you, Murat. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm very impressed by the conference so far. I mean, having so many people, it's kind of intimidating and overwhelming. So here we are. We're going to be talking about international migration and social cohesion. And as Murat said, I've been involved with this enterprise called Metropolis for over 20 years. And we've been talking about social cohesion for most of these 20 years. And usually in the sense that immigration is seen by many people to threaten social cohesion. So this is what I want to talk about today. Now, the first thing I have to admit, despite what we've already heard from Beth and Katharina, I don't know what social cohesion is. I really don't. But maybe I should stop now, Murat, but having admitted that. But one thing that I would like to do is just explore the concept a little bit, indicate what it's not. The first thing I'll say is that I don't believe that integration and social cohesion are synonyms. I don't think they're the same thing. And this may be difficult for the translators, but the way I regard the relationship between the integration of immigrants and social cohesion is that the one is a means to the other. They're not identical, but if you have successful integration, chances are enhanced that you will have higher degrees of social cohesion. At least that's how things seem to me. But quite frankly, the term social cohesion is ambiguous. You might even say it's vague. And people mean various things by it. I think it's very hard to pin down. It's easy to recognize when social cohesion is lacking. For example, just take obvious examples. We've been speaking about Syria for the last two presentations. Syria is clearly a society that is sorely lacking in social cohesion. I would want to argue that countries that are at civil war, countries that are facing political insurrections, are countries that clearly lack social cohesion. I might drop it down a little bit. I come from Canada, and about 40 years ago, we had one of our provinces, the province of Quebec, which was threatening to leave Canada, to separate politically from Canada. And at this time, it seems to me that we had lost a significant degree of social cohesion within Canada. We've since recovered, but one thing that this experience that we had illustrates is that social cohesion is something that tends to be valued. It's something that we think societies ought to have more of than less of. So, for example, we think that societies with high degrees of social cohesion are going to be not only more harmonious, but they're going to be more prosperous, that economies will do better in a cohesive society than in one that is not cohesive. Why is that? Perhaps because they'll exhibit higher degrees of social capital, that people will trust one another more than in societies that are not cohesive. And trust tends to form the basis of all kinds of potential within a society, not only economic potential, but just it forms the basis of people willing to work together towards common projects. It allows the possibility of common projects. And you might talk at the level of a country as a whole, or you might talk about individual subregions, or of course, and this is why we're at this conference now, we might talk about it at the level of cities or other urban areas. So what is the basis then going to be of social cohesion for a city, for a state, for a country? Well, I think it's extraordinarily varied. But I think it's important to point out some of the potentials, some of the possible answers here. So in some countries that have long-standing, and I'll call them historically privileged traditions, cultural traditions, this can form the basis not only of social cohesion, but it can also form the basis of a fear that immigration will cause social cohesion to diminish. Shared languages can matter. In the case of the separatist movement in Quebec in Canada, language was the issue. It was the basis for that Quebec nationalist movement. Religion can be, in some countries, a foundation for social cohesion, and so on and so forth. I would also want to argue, though, that an accepted political tradition can form the basis of social cohesion, can form the basis of a willingness for a people to act in concert with one another to achieve common goals. So none of this is definitive. I know that Katharina referred to a definition of social cohesion. I'm not able to do that, but I hope that this gives just a bit of a flavor for what I'm trying here to talk about. But one thing I want to caution us on, I said that generally speaking, we think that societies that have a greater degree of social cohesion are more prosperous and so on, are going to be better off, more successful than those with less. But let's not think that societies with a full degree, a maximum degree, an infinite degree of social cohesion are going to be perfect societies, as it were. And the reason I say that is that it seems to me that any society that can achieve absolutely full cohesion is going to be a totalitarian society. That a democracy is not ever going to achieve full cohesion. So, what's the lesson here? Beware of asking for too much. A thriving democracy thrives on the basis of debate. It thrives on the basis of difference. It can, in a multicultural society like the one that I'm from, like the one that Beth is from, it can thrive on the differences between the cultures that happen to live in the country. It can thrive on the basis of the different religions and different value sets. So if we think in terms of how much social cohesion we want, don't go too far, because then you're going to end up in a situation where democracy will no longer be possible. So I just offer this as a bit of background. Democracies, I think, are extraordinarily robust when it comes to cohesion. Right now, of course, in the United Kingdom, we have quite an astonishing debate on whether or not the country should leave the EU. This debate, which is very fractious, is very polarized, I don't believe is going to reduce the social cohesion of the United Kingdom. In the country to my south, we've got an extraordinarily polarized political condition right now. I don't think that is going to threaten the social cohesion of the United States. Economic disparity might, but I don't see the current political debate as being such a threat. So why is it that we've heard so much over the last 20 years about immigration being a threat to social cohesion? Well, it seems to me that it's rooted in a fear of the difference that immigrants are going to introduce to a society. And where we used to hear a lot, I think more 10 years ago than we do now, was about different value systems. That when, and especially we heard this in European societies, where the introduction, particularly of large numbers of immigrants from Islamic countries, was going to change the value or threaten the value system of an historical tradition in some of these European countries. And so if you had a number of people fearing, a number of commentators, politicians fearing the impact of immigration on a historically traditional set of values and cultural norms, et cetera, et cetera. And so the worry was that the prosperity of European countries would decline, that the harmony of the societies would be degraded, that inequality would rise, and so on. I happen to think that all of this is nonsense. And I'll just take you through a little story about mostly comes out of my country, and in fact, two particular cities, Toronto and Vancouver. Now, we hear a lot, and we did hear a lot of talk in the European context as well, about ethnic enclaves, and how people who live in ethnic enclaves are at risk of living merely parallel lives to the rest of society, and that if they were so isolated that they could then become a threat to national security as well as to cultural integrity, and all of this stuff that we heard coming out of the far right in Europe. In Toronto and Vancouver, we have long-standing ethnic enclaves. By the way, Toronto and Vancouver both have a population where more than 50% of the people, of the residents, were born outside of Canada, and that more than 50% of the people are what Canadians still call visible minorities. There are enclaves in Toronto where 90% of the people are ethnic Chinese. There are enclaves in Vancouver where 90% of the residents are ethnic South Asian. These communities are very interesting. They are not only very homogeneous, but many of the people who live there live transnational lives, 1 foot in Canada, 1 foot in Vancouver, 1 foot in Hong Kong, or 1 foot in the Punjab, et cetera, et cetera. But they also work in the enclave. They go to school in the enclave. They socialize in the enclave. They use their homeland language in the enclave. So you might think that this would be a perfect situation for a decline in social cohesion. Hasn't happened. Because these same enclaves participate in the broader goings-on, broader workings of the cities of Toronto and Vancouver. They participate in political life. The representatives on city council are members of these minority communities. They influence the arts, they influence the political discussion, and so on and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make is that immigration on its own is not going to threaten social cohesion, because here we have extreme cases where there's been no threat whatsoever. It's how diversity is managed that is going to make the difference. Toronto, by the way, has as its city motto, diversity, our strength. Just the opposite of this fear that some people have that immigration is going to destroy social cohesion. Okay, so I said before that extreme social cohesion is going to be a threat to democracy, and the point I would restate that social cohesion does not require uniformity. Integration, it seems to me, can provide another basis, another form of a common purpose than culture, than religion, than language, and so on. Am I supposed to be looking at that? That's wrong. How much time do I have? I have that much time? Okay, so, sorry, we have a screen here that you don't see. Okay, so I think that I'm going to echo some of what Katharina said earlier about a basis, a non-cultural, a non-ethnic, a non-religious basis for social cohesion in terms of the participation of minority groups in the workings of a society. Now, I'll try to remember that we're now talking about urban issues. So let's talk in terms of the role that minority communities play in urban planning. This is an area of immigration research that I think is largely ignored. We pay very little attention to urban planning. We talk a lot about policy, but we almost never talk about actual planning and the implementation of plans. But there is a type of urban planning that is usually called multicultural planning. And what it does is, rather than look at the needs of a generic population, simply in terms of the number of residents or the number, density per square mile and so on and so forth, it looks, in addition, at the specific interests of the different groups who happen to live in the city. So what I want to suggest in the 3 minutes that I've got left is that a way to maintain or to build, or preserve social cohesion within a city is to involve the minority communities in the management of the day-to-day panoply of issues that a city faces. Basic things like, how is land going to be used? Where are new housing developments going to be located? How is transportation, how is public transit managed? Do public transit systems reach out to the minority communities, or are the minority communities less well served than the mainstream communities? Where can you locate a new place of worship? This is always contentious. Not because the people who go to the place of worship are going to be praying to a God that the others don't recognize. No, what's the big issue? Parking. So if we get right down to the mundane aspects of managing a city, then you've got a set of common concerns, the resolution of which can bring people together, people from different communities together, and through that discussion, or call it negotiation, about how the city will manage its day-to-day affairs, you can build trust throughout these different communities. And so you enhance mutual understanding of each other. You enhance, ultimately, the degree of trust that you are going to have. So what I would suggest is that cities that are facing high levels of immigration, cities that experience high levels of cultural and ethnic diversity, that in order to ensure that you don't lose the cohesiveness of your city, that you involve these communities in the act of planning. So that means more than consultations. It means having representation in community associations, in business associations, in committees that are struck to oversee the operations of police departments and education systems and healthcare systems and so on and so forth, the day-to-day workings of a city. So in conclusion, immigration, in my view, is no threat in itself to social cohesion, but badly managed integration can marginalize immigrant communities, and this marginalization can unnecessarily damage the cohesion of a society. So let's look at the city level let's look at how planning is carried out as one way to sustain or perhaps even build a new cohesion within a city. Thank you, Murat.
Şimdi değerli izleyicilerimiz fark etmiyorlar.
So we have these screens in front of us and a meter, but it starts at 17 minutes, not 10 minutes, as I said at the beginning, and that's what our speakers try and adhere to. So it is the screens that they look at. So please, I mean, sometimes we go beyond our time limits, but this is quite a good opportunity to delve into this really important topic, social cohesion. Sometimes we think that learning the language would be a quick fix, but social cohesion sometimes is easy to get within the same society. Two Germanys stayed apart for 45 years, and still today between the West and the East, people are discussing what cohesion should look like, and we can give examples from Turkey as well. So this is a topic that has many different dimensions. Ahmet İçduygu is one of the leading names on immigration here in Turkey. Koç is within the Koç University, Migration Studies. It is one of the oldest of such institutions in Turkey. So we'd like to hear from our esteemed guest now. Our guest is also going to take a look at the theory. Our professor completed their PhD in Australia, National University in Australia. So they're going to give us some insights about internal and external immigration. So without further ado, I'd like to give the word to our speaker. But before that, here's a bit of warning. Please send your questions to us via the app. We have received a couple of questions, but if you have any questions for our panelists, please log on to the app and send us your questions. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim Murat.
Thank you very much, Murat, for this brilliant introduction. I also would like to thank the organization committee and the Marmara Association of Municipalities for organizing this event. We're focusing on the city that we live in, and we're focusing on migration, both very important topics. My presentation is in English, so I am I'm going to deliver my presentation in Turkish. The title for this session is Human Mobility on an International Scale and Social Cohesion. And just like Murat has said, actually, I am going to focus on the theory a bit, but I do not wish to bore you too much. Just offer you a bit of an analysis and then focus on some more insights on social cohesion and how these apply to protracted periods of migration, and especially Syrian refugees here in Turkey. My presentation is composed of 4 parts. I'm going to talk about human mobility and social cohesion and the link between the two, and what lies beneath these concepts, and in terms of social diversity, what is the perspective that we should adopt. I will focus on that, and then I will focus on social cohesion, and I'd like to thank Howard as well, because he also talked about what this entails during his remarks, provided me with a backdrop, and then I will talk about social cohesion, and especially when refugees stay at a place for a long time, being permanent, being temporary, these concepts, and also I will focus on the experiences of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and say a few words about the policy of Turkey. Now, it is important that we discuss these concepts. There is literature all across the world, especially in countries that receive a lot of immigration, use different concepts, and when we encounter immigration in Turkey as well, we try to find Turkish equivalents for these concepts and words. Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Well, the organizers of this panel translated as sosyal uyum, social harmony, into Turkish. Of course, it can be translated as social integration, but I mean the concept of integration in Western languages, integration in English, and in Turkish we use the same word, entegrasyon. And now with the Syrian refugees after 2013, we had a legislation that was passed, and we use integration in our daily lives in Turkey as well, but integration is used as harmony, mainly so to mean harmony. So integration and social, or integration versus social cohesion, actually these are two different things, and from time to time we juxtapose these two concepts, and for Turkish scientists it is a reminder that we need to come up with new concepts or Turkish words for these concepts. In 2019, actually, for the next 5 years, a developmental plan was announced, ratified by the parliament, announced by the president's office, ratified by the president's office. When you read that text, you also see a couple of paragraphs about migration, immigration, and uses the word harmony or cohesion, but that I think corresponds to integration. So without further ado, let me say that integration actually defines a process, and that is like a two-sided adaptation process whereby a relationship is forged between the incoming refugees and the local communities. And social cohesion is a byproduct of it, whether there's a harmony or not in the society, and I think this is an important distinction. Previous speakers also talked about the importance of this, especially Howard talked about the importance of this. All around the world, there's a lot of debate going on, and also in scientific circles and political circles as well. International immigration and ethnic diversity that it brings about, the fact that different people or ethnic groups live in the same society, live together, is something that we need to discuss. Of course, regardless of immigration, social cohesion is a pertinent topic for every society, but some people feel that immigration could pose a threat to social cohesion. There's an economic side to this. It's not just a matter of identity, and this is what I'd like to basically focus on. At the end of 19th century, in the world of science and all around the world, there were two emerging concepts. And of course, there's a backdrop to this. One is nation state, that was philosophized for the first time in 16th century, and then social cohesion. So, why do people feel that immigration could pose a threat to social cohesion? I think we would do well to focus on the concept of nation state, and this is based on a conceptualization, and this tries to demonstrate an ideal, but this ideal, Weber has ideal types, and it's a conceptualization that is never going to come to pass. I mean, a nation state will never be entirely homogeneous. When you look at history, in no age do you see a completely homogeneous nation state. You don't have any such purity. And even the most ardent nationalists feel that this is an ideal that will never come to pass. And I think this is a problem because we always aspire to be a homogeneous society, and if something comes up to derail that homogeneity, we get concerned. But that has never been the case, and never ever shall it be the case in the future either. This is an ideal, an unrealistic ideal, and we need to make peace with that. And again, this is something that was bequeathed to us by the 19th century. These matters were discussed at the beginning of the 20th century as well, and still it's a pertinent topic. Social cohesion, likewise. Famous sociologist Durkheim coined this for the first time, used this for societies, and has two definitions. One is the absence of social conflict. By conflict we don't mean armed conflict, but different ethnicities, different income groups, or different races living side by side happily, or based on gender, and so on and so forth. So there to be no conflict between these different groups, or all these people living happily side by side in harmony, and this is what is proposed with this concept. And this is going to prevent conflict in the society, and secondly, amongst components that make up a society, some sort of a relationship will be forged. In the absence of these, or some people think that immigration derails both of these processes. So people who see immigration as a threat, and people who want to intervene are basing their thoughts on these pretexts. But we need to realize that a nation state is a construct. In no society do you get pure homogeneity, or you don't get any society with no conflict. When you live in Turkey or in any Middle Eastern country, you see that there's a lot of tension, and I don't necessarily mean armed conflict. And also, there is no ideal thing such as a nation state. So actually, regarding immigration, the problem is, or what is seen as a problem, is the fact that immigration, international immigration, brings diversity to societies, and we don't know what to do with that diversity. When we look at 20th century, we see that certain concepts were utilized, certain policies were devised, and at the time of the Ottoman Empire, you had the nation system, millet system, but in nation states as well, you see that certain groups are shut out. And in the 20s, 30s in Europe, the rise of fascism, certain groups were to be shut out, and unfortunately we've had similar examples all throughout history. And also you can live in the same region, but you can live in segregation, or you try to coexist and co-live. In the 20th century, coexistence is based on, or emerges on, two concepts. At the beginning of the 20th century, today we use the term assimilation in a negative sense, and right now assimilation, may be positive, because in terms of shutting out other groups, assimilation is actually the lesser of two evils. Like, I see you fit to be a part of me, and I'm not suggesting here that assimilation is good, but at the beginning of 20th century, this is how assimilation was seen and conceptualized in countries that received a lot of immigration, like the US and Australia. But after the Second World War, diversity within nation states proved to be difficult, and globalization and so on and so forth took place. Diversity increased, so the concept of integration was used, and then after the 70s, multiculturalism became a hot debate. The reason why I'm saying these things is because we're talking about harmony, cohesion, and making policies to achieve that, but we also need to look at how the states view these things, because these have an impact on state policies as well. That's why I wanted to tell you about these. So let me as for social cohesion, there are different dimensions that I would like to touch upon. Different scientists created this model. 4 or 5 concepts are important for social cohesion. One of these is recognition of the groups, not rejecting one another, and especially in terms of the incoming community, there needs to be a sense of belonging, an aspiration to belong, and these 2 concepts, recognition and belonging, are important. So for social communication, these are key. And also economic internalization, or inclusion. There's a social dimension to this, but economically people must be integrated as well, and legitimacy. Being legitimate, I mean, you need a legal framework, you need a social understanding for that to happen, and also participation is equally important. All the way up to political inclusion, casting a vote, and being a citizen. So this discussion, I mean, when we talk about protracted periods of being a refugee. Now, what I talked about recently, just now, was more or less a general framework, but regarding refugees, here's what the most problematic point is. Refugees are people who are forced out of their homes, and we believe that they will go back to their homes. We see this as a temporary situation, but all across the globe, whether we like it or not, that really is not the case. I mean, the Afghanistan example, case of Afghanistan is important. For the last 40 years. This has been going on, but we didn't necessarily know about it until Afghani refugees started coming to us. Since the 70s, actually, this has been going on. So, just to summarize, in today's world, these periods are prolonged. If there is a resolution, either these people are going to go back to their homeland or go somewhere else or integrate into the host country. So just to draw a conclusion very quickly about the Syrian refugees, we know that repatriation or other countries do not wish to take responsibility, so repatriation or resettlement could prove difficult, and then integration or social cohesion is something that becomes something that we need to discuss. But let me also say very quickly that regarding refugees, whether they are here to stay or not, is something that is discussed by the host communities and for the refugees themselves as well. This is a question for all parties involved. So unless we can solve that, we will always have problems about cohesion, both for the host country, host communities, and the incoming communities. So let me also draw a couple of conclusions from what I have said. You see the policy changes in Turkey and the increase in numbers. This is a graph about that. Turkey pursued an open door policy and thought that it would be a short period. Turkey accepted these people, and then after 2015, and also the numbers skyrocketed. We didn't expect these numbers to go up all the way up to 2.5 million, and then there was an influx into Europe in 2015, and then there was there was an agreement with the EU, and from that point onwards an integration discussion started, although this was not announced publicly by the state. Some work permits were made, given, and a couple of weeks before the coup attempt, the president talked about citizenship, and then 100,000 people have received citizenship by now. Although this has not been dubbed integration by the state, this process has started in Turkey. In the last 2 years, well, this policy has been going on, and in 2019, in the 5-year developmental plan, there's a cohesion section, specially dedicated section. But in every country you have media, politics, and the society, and you need to respect these three pillars. But when it comes to immigration, when these three parties get together, the combination is quite toxic. Politicians listen to the public media creates the public opinion and has an impact on the policy making as well. So these are dangerous parties to get together when it comes to immigration. When there's a disgruntled public, then the politics shy away from making bold moves. And now in Turkey we're talking about resettlement because of this. Very quickly, may I just say one sentence? I'm very sorry I have gone beyond my time limit majorly, but up until now, Turkey, yes, this is a difficult topic, and I don't think the state has been able to make a decision properly, but it was mainly about the question whether this was a temporary situation or whether these people were here to stay. That's a question that needs to be reckoned with. Thank you.
Hocam çok teşekkür ederim. Siz çok konuşmak istediğiniz için.
Professor, thank you so much. It wasn't because you wanted to talk a lot, but because it's an important topic that you talked a lot. We have some time challenges here. Maybe we will ask the municipalities union to give us an extra 10 minutes, I hope. By the way, let me remind you once again, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to use the application to send your question. Our last speaker is from Columbia University from US, Neeraj Kaushal. I would like to thank her for coming here. She works in the field of social policy, so her perspective is going to be very important and different for cohesion. We will be learning a lot from her. So I don't want to take any time by reading her CV. I will directly give the floor to her.
Thank you, Murat.
Yes, please. Okay.
And thank you. I'd like to thank the Marmara Urban Forum for inviting me and also for organizing this very amazing session. The title of my talk is Blame the Immigrant or the Foreigner. And I'll talk about the growing discontent against global movement of people. So just in case I'm not able to finish my talk, let me just give an outline, which is that I'll talk about the growing discontents and give how it's not just a Western phenomena, it's a global phenomena. What are the causes of these rising discontent that you see against immigrants globally? About 100 years ago, we saw similar discontents, mostly starting in the United States, but then also spreading in Latin American countries, which led to a closing down of doors for immigrants. And the question that I would like to ask is history going to repeat itself? I talk a little bit about what are the primary triggers of this discontent. Is immigration a cause or merely a scapegoat? So since 2010, more particularly, we've seen most of Europe is veering towards the far right. Anti-immigration movements are growing in many countries. In some countries, you see a pendulum going backward and forward, for instance, in France. But in many other countries, you see a distinct shift towards growing anti-immigration movements. More particularly in 2016, we saw in Britain, Brexit, one of the main causes of Britain leaving the EU was immigration. United States, a place where I teach, there is a growing sentiment against immigration. So here President Trump is not just telling immigrants to leave, but also this is kind of in showing that how there's a very small minority, small but vocal minority that is fed up with welcoming immigrants. So there's growing discontent towards them. But I would say that it's not just a Western phenomena. Singapore, a tiny island state, which has got a lot of economic prosperity because of foreigners, and also foreign capital. In 2013, they said that they would like to have Singapore just for Singaporeans. India, where I'm from, the new government has set up a registry system to actually count the number of illegal Bangladeshis. And the Home Minister has said that we would set up a fence so that not even a bird could fly across. Pakistan, a few years ago, has been deporting Afghani refugees, but it's not just limited to South Asian countries. In Malaysia and Thailand, they turned away both loads of Bangladeshi and Rohingya migrants. In Brazil, most of Latin America has been far more tolerant of immigrants, but in Brazil we see they want to have a virtual wall. In Saudi Arabia, they want to have wall and borders. I can just go on and on, giving you a survey of how globally, not just in Europe or the Americas, but also in Africa and Asia, there's growing discontent towards immigration. And the question is, will history repeat itself? Well, we've actually seen that many countries are responding to these growing discontent by constructing walls, fences, and other physical barriers. So in 1889, when the Berlin Wall fell, there were 16 cross-border fences around the world. By 2016, the number had risen to 65. Here, those of you who follow US and China trade wars, you must have seen that there's not much love that President Trump have for foreign leaders, especially President Xi Jinping. But he's very surprised how China was able to get Mongolia to pay for the wall, because he would like Mexico to pay for the wall. So there are a few examples of what you see that this rising discontent towards immigration has led to. For instance, at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis, we saw several Schengen countries actually creating temporary border controls for border-free Europe. So there were Schengen countries, Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Poland, and Sweden had created various kinds of controls. European Union has signed many agreements with sending countries to restrict flows. Many countries have gone beyond that. Netherlands and Denmark, at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis, were having these advertisements in Lebanon newspapers saying, telling refugees, why do you want to come to Europe? Because Europe will not welcome you. Some of that we saw, part of the impact of that was actually a decline in refugee flows. But mostly what we see happening is that migrants adopt perilous routes. So it does not reduce migration, but they actually adopt perilous routes, so that leads to high death toll. In the long run, we've seen that in many parts of the world where migrants actually stop going. For instance, we've seen that in the case of Mexico to the US. Now, the question that I asked also in a book that I just published on the topic was, are these discontents that we are seeing globally related to migration, or is it because of some other factors? I will give you a few examples here where I actually prove that it's really not migration per se that is causing the discontents. There's something else going on. There are some other core fundamental issues in many of the receiving countries, and immigrants are just a scapegoat. So let me start with Brexit. When the election results of Brexit legislative results was out, it became clear that the top 10 districts with the lowest number of votes for leaving were also the ones that had the largest number of, between 28 to 45% of their population was foreign born. On the other hand, the top 10 districts that voted for Brexit, they wanted to leave. These are the places where there was the minimum number of between 3 to 15% of the population was foreign born. Let me give you a few other examples. For instance, in EU, the countries that have been most against refugee settlement Poland has said that they would not like to have a single Syrian refugee settled within Poland, are also the ones that do not have many foreigners living there. In the EU, about 12% of their population is foreign-born, but in Poland, it's less than 2% of their population is foreign-born, and the proportion of Muslim migrants must be even lower. Similarly, Hungary, which has 6% of their population is foreign-born, they do not want any of their any Syrian refugee to resettle. So the point is that it's not countries that have a large number of foreigners are the ones that are anxious of immigrants, that are against immigrant resettlement. Now let me come to places within countries. So in the United States, states that have the highest number of immigrants, one of them is New York, the other is California. These are also the states that have gone beyond their, to attract a lot of immigrants. New York has programs that provide health insurance for the undocumented. They have programs, they have an ID system so that undocumented people can have an identity in that state, in the city. So it's not just countries that have low number of immigrants, but even within countries, there are places where there's fewer number of foreigners, are the places where they don't want to welcome more foreigners, and the places that have a large number of foreigners are also the ones they go out of their way to welcome. So one example, of Turkish, in Turkey, the Syrian refugee influx has been largest here, and surveys show that there's also more tolerance for refugees than in many European countries. Now, what is the impact of this discontent? Well, in some countries, the ultra-conservative parties are basically articulating what they think are the fears of immigrants. But in most places, they are basically using public fear to advance their exclusionist agenda. In a way, they are using the public fear, but they want to advance their exclusionist agenda. So I believe that the primary cause of discontent that you see around the world is not immigration per se, it's not the volume of immigration nor the pace of immigration, but mostly the appetite of nations to absorb immigrants, is the ability of nations to manage. So it's not an immigration crisis, it's the crisis of immigration management, I would say. So I would even go on to say that, immigration is not a crisis. Let's look at the other dimensions of globalization that we see. So what I have here in this chart is export as a proportion of GDP. And I give data for three different points in our history. About 150 years ago, it was 5% of GDP. About 1991, it rose by 20%. And even in the current phase, when we talk about all deglobalization, fears of globalization, the number is rising. Another dimension here is foreign direct investment, which has gone. Here I have a much shorter period from 1971 to 2017, and it has grown by more than 100 times. What about immigration? It was 3% about 100 years ago. In 1991, it was 3% of the world population, and 2015, it's still 3%. So immigration is basically just keeping pace with the growth in population in the world. It's not growing. So for me, it's more of a surprise that despite all the global inequalities that prevail in the world, immigration is only keeping pace with the population growth. And I would say one of the reasons for that is that people do not want to move. So it's not just a crisis. It's not just not a crisis. I would say that most of the immigration that we see around the world today is through legal channels. It has happened because countries have opened up their visa policies. It's happened because cost of travel has declined, and many countries, as India and China, they become economically prosperous, there is a larger number of population in these countries that is leaving these countries to settle elsewhere. In my book that I just referred to, I looked at 7 core drivers of discontent, and I looked at whether immigration has caused any of those discontent. The 7 drivers, I looked at culture and identity, rising economic inequality in industrialized countries, productivity stagnation, demographic and social change, loss of government, confidence in government, rising refugee movements and international terrorism and national security. And for each of these factors, I try to look at, is immigration causing any of them, or what is the impact of these factors, of immigration on these factors? And I come to the conclusion that immigration can actually resolve some of these issues, and that immigration is not the cause of these factors. I will not go through all of these factors, but I'll give you a few examples. So culture and identity, it's a major issue in many countries. Absorptive capacity of countries actually differ across nations. So let me give you an example. Japan has very low tolerance towards immigrants. Poland has very low tolerance towards immigrants because of cultural factors. These also are the countries that have very few immigrants. Canada has very high tolerance towards immigrants, and Canada also has high immigration. I gave earlier an example of United states and cities within United States that have high immigration are also the ones that want immigrants the most. The states that have very little tolerance towards immigrants, for instance, Montana, South Dakota, also the ones that have hardly any immigrants. So let's look at another factor, which is growing wage inequality in the world. So we do see this is a phenomena that is happening globally, but is immigration the cause of this phenomena? And people who have done research on this, they found that one of the primary factors of this is technological change. Foreign trade is a second factor. Two together would account for something like 90% of the growing wage inequality in Western countries. And after that, the remaining 5 to 10% is a host of factors that includes decline in unionization, increase in women's entry into the labor force, and immigration happens to be one of those large number of factors. At the same time, we also see that many emerging economies are becoming really competitor for Western countries. Fortune 500 companies, the number of companies in developing countries has risen from 5% to 26%. So earlier, many emerging economies were doing low-end work, but now they're doing a lot of high-end work. And that could be one of the factors that is creating a lot of discontent. Declining productivity in Western country is a cause of the discontent, but I think immigration can actually, countries that have the ability, have the inclination to be able to absorb immigrants, they can actually benefit by immigration in increasing their productivity. This is a chart which actually shows you how the population of many Western countries is going to change in the next 50 years, 35 years actually. And this actually shows you that there are very few countries where we'll see an increase in population. Mostly in Africa, you'll see a rise in population, and most countries are actually facing a decline in their working age population. In China, we'll actually see 150 people, a decline in working age population by 150 million in the next 35 years. And that could be one of the reasons why we'll see so much discontent. On the one side, there's this fear that in order to stay productive, you need more talent. On the other side, there is the cultural ability to absorb immigration. I think this would be one of my last charts where You can see the last question in my slide that I wanted to ask was, where is immigration going to grow? And you see, I'll just point to two numbers here. In Europe, in 2000, 12% of the world population was in Europe. Similarly, 13% of the world population was in Africa. In 50 years from then, world population in Europe is going to be 7% and world population in Africa 20%. So that just tells you where we are going to. The pressures for immigration are going to increase, not just because there's higher population in Africa, just because there's declining, shrinking population in Europe as well. So the pressure for immigration we'll see to increase over time, and discontents for immigration are also increasing. Immigration, I would end by saying that is an economic phenomena. Immigrants would go where economic forces will take them. So you will see actually now a rise in immigration in many Asian countries that have so far been the sending countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Neeraj. Çok teşekkür ediyorum şu an.
Thank you. I'm looking at my time. We are really running behind our time, but still we have some questions from the audience. And Elizabeth Ferris, she really abided by her time, and as the first speaker I really pressured her. I'm very sorry for that. She had only 10 minutes to talk, so I will ask her a question, and then I will be referring the questions that we received to our speakers.
On social cohesion, is cultural proximity enough? That's the first question. Whether cultural affinity is more important, or whether numbers are more important, or process management is more important. What would you say? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that cultural affinity is really key. That communities that receive people, whether they're immigrating from other countries or from neighboring areas within their country, find it easier to integrate when they speak the same language, they have a common religion, have similar cultural practices, that can be more important than the sheer numbers of people who arrive.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Şimdi ikinci bir soru.
Second question. Multicultural urban planning. Howard talked about this. Multicultural urban planning. On the one side, is this really possible for established societies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand? These are immigration countries. How about established societies? Is this really possible, a multicultural urban planning? How can that be achieved? What would you say? Thank you.
I don't see that the youthfulness of Canada compared to, say, Italy is pertinent at all. There was a time when Canadian society was almost entirely dominated by people from the United Kingdom and France. And in that sense, it was much like, it had that kind of cultural homogeneity that some older societies perhaps have had. But when immigrants started coming to Canada from other parts of the world, the country simply adapted, and I don't see any reason why other countries couldn't do the same thing.
Okay. Katharina.
Katharina.
Experience in very different countries. Sorry. What's the biggest challenge as a UN institution in Turkey for you, for integration and then for social cohesion?
Probably one of the biggest challenges is indeed to support Turkish actors more than a UN refugee agency can do in avoiding social tensions, reducing social tensions, addressing social tensions, fostering social cohesion. There we can only have a supporting role because it's unprecedented that a country hosts so many refugees and protects so many refugees over such a now protracted period of time. So that is indeed, I would say now, one of the bigger challenges facing us here in Turkey to maintain that welcoming spirit, to address the concerns and the grievances of host communities moving forward in the absence of at this point conditions that prompt many of the refugees to return voluntarily to their country of origin.
An additional question, sorry. What about the civil society, NGOs in Turkey? With your cooperation and then your work.
As I refer to Turkish actors, supporting Turkish actors, and there indeed municipalities, local actors, civil society play an extremely important and invaluable role. So civil society, academics, because that's where that's the actors and the stakeholders that foster social connections and social cohesions,
Okay.
and not a UN agency.
Yes, thank you very much. Ahmet Hocam, bir şey söylediniz. Bu bir
Professor Ahmet, you talked about a triangle that shouldn't get together, politicians, media, and the public.
kamuoyu, pardon. Siyaset, medya, kamuoyu üçgeni ve bu
So this triangle, this triad, and how it can have a detrimental effect on social cohesion, you said. So can you please, how can we turn this into something positive? What is the key, within the triad, or does it lie somewhere else altogether? Of course, without a doubt, media literacy is very important, or raising awareness with the media is very important, so that news stories are based on facts, not misperceptions. But in a way, this is unavoidable as well, especially the relationship between politicians and the public at large. You need to be in power, you need to maintain your power, and that's why you need to lend a listening ear to the public. But public opinion is something that can be shaped or generated. So if politicians have good intentions, I think they can have a positive impact on the public opinion, because there's plurality within the public as well. So that's why this is important. Of course, it is possible to turn this into something positive rather than a problem. One last question to Neeraj, and then we will have to conclude this session. Here's the question. In your work, refugees, immigrants, social cohesion, is there a difference between refugees and immigrants, do you think, or not, in terms of social cohesion?
I think in terms of at the point of entry, this is an important point. There's a lot more sympathy towards refugees in most societies. But over time, I think the distinctions begin to fade, in the sense that within the receiving community, people don't really make much distinction between the two populations. That over time, it's really the integration of the two populations that results in whether there's more social cohesion or not.
Okay. Efendim, hepinize
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. The session is adjourned. We did our best to get and ask as many questions as possible. The biggest word of thanks go to our panelists coming all the way from the States, from Canada, Elizabeth Ferris, Howard Duncan, Neeraj Kaushal, and of course, Katharina Lumpp and Ahmet İçduygu. Thank you very much indeed.